We're going to talk in this lecture about Indian policy during the period of the Confederation government. Now, last lecture we finished the British Empire. We had a war that resulted in part from British decisions regarding Indian policy, the creation of an Indian reserve west of the Allegheny Mountains, an area in which English colonists were not welcome. Colonial governors were prohibited from granting lands. This, as we discussed and learned, antagonized loads of colonists and was one of the precipitating causes of the American Revolution. Now, the new government that formed, we call the Confederation government because they adopted Articles of Confederation among the colonies. They all sent representatives to Philadelphia, sat down, and created a new nation, the United States, by declaration in 1776. But before that happened, this new Confederation government, which existed for a time within the British Empire, started devising, of necessity, its own Indian policy. And the government chose to simply mirror what the British had done, with very slight differences. The threshold issue was, should Indian policy be national? Should it be centralized, or should it be localized? Should the individual colonies in rebellion reassume responsibility for conducting relations with the tribes within their claimed jurisdiction, or should this new Confederation government have that responsibility? And the Confederation government, driven in part by perceived military necessity, chose to mirror what the British had done and to claim that jurisdiction itself. We see this manifested in a couple of ways. Even before independence was declared in July 1775, just a few months after the battles at Lexington and Concord, the Confederation government adopted the British model of Indian departments and created 3 departments, a northern, a middle, and a southern department, staffed them and gave the superintendents of those departments primary responsibility for conducting relations with the tribes that were within the geographic limits of those departments. This again being just what the British had done starting in 1755, the only difference being the Confederation government opted to have 3 departments as opposed to 2. The principal mission of the superintendents of those departments, at least in the early era, was to keep the tribes neutral during the military struggle against Britain. The last thing the Confederation government figured the colonies needed was another version of the French and Indian War, an English and Indian War, where the colonies in rebellion would not only have to fight against the British Army, but would have to fight against tribes on the frontier allied with the British. So that was the goal. And to a certain extent, these negotiators, these colonial agents, were successful. Independence was declared in 1776. Tribes still largely neutral, although that was about to change. The Confederation government, once it became independent, decided that it needed to draft some form of constitution for itself. This was also a revolutionary gesture. We're now a new state. We're a new state created in a Lockean intellectual world. That's a world in which people conceive, or liberal political thinkers in any event, conceive of states, of nations, as the products of agreement among members of a political community, individual members. So we Americans are going to get together, create a new government, and here's what it's going to be able to do. Here's how it's going to operate. The document, our first constitution, our first national constitution, was called the Articles of Confederation, adopted by Congress in 1777, but not ratified until 1781, because unanimous ratification was called for in the Articles themselves, and Maryland was a holdout. But it included a provision relating to Indian affairs. It included a provision intended to primarily vest in the central government of the new Confederation, as the British had done, responsibility for the conduct of affairs, of foreign affairs, if you will, with the native nations in North America. This delegation of power was found in Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation. It said, the relevant language, the United States in Congress assembled shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the trade and managing all affairs with the Indians, and then a comma, not members of any of the states, provided that the legislative right of any state within its own limits be not infringed or violated. Now, it's the part after the comma that caused this grant of power, recognition of power, delegation of power to the federal government, the Confederation government, to be hopelessly confusing. What did it mean to say that the Confederation government had power to conduct all Indian affairs, except those involving tribes within states or colonies in rebellion, given that the colonies had land claims that comprehended all of the Indian country? Who was responsible given that language? James Madison, one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers in Federalist 42, called this language in Article 9 absolutely incomprehensible. And he was right. But the Confederation government did sort of muddle along and take primary responsibility for the conduct of Indian affairs. That said, the states continued to engage or reassumed the old colonial responsibility for engaging in Indian affairs themselves, including purchasing Indian lands. Now that the proclamation was gone, the states, including New York, decided we're free to start issuing land patents and purchasing lands from tribes, and did so with impunity during much of this period. Now, the war proceeds, the Confederation government limping along under these unratified articles. The Confederal agents out west eventually deciding that the tribes are not going to remain neutral. The British are aggressively trying to pull in tribal allies. The British had a better case, incidentally. All the British had to do was remind the tribes that the source of their problems in the years before the Revolution had been the individual colonists and colonies. I mean, they're the people who are making bad deals with you. They're the people who are buying your lands. They're the people that you're getting into military conflict with. It's not us. It's not the British Army. It's these crazy colonists. And a number of tribes decided, yeah, this is our chance. We are going to fight with the British, alongside the British, and teach these colonists a lesson, with the expectation that there would be concessions made to the tribes that sided with the British once the war was done. The most prominent in a military sense of these tribes that sided with the British included the Mohawks and the Seneca Nation of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, and the Cherokees, who actually launched an unsuccessful invasion against the Virginia and North Carolina backcountry during the war, and suffered military defeat, but were actively engaged in the conflict on the side of the British. There were some tribes that agreed to ally with the Americans in rebellion. And the Americans, once tribes were siding with the British, started actively seeking allies. The Tuscarora Nation and the Oneida Nation of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy signed or agreed to ally with the United States. This had the consequence, of course, of splitting that confederacy, and the history of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy is beyond the scope of this course, but it's a fascinating history, and the fact that the different nations of the Confederacy fought on different sides was devastating, certainly in the short term, for the political history of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Well, war continued with native participants, as we've seen, fighting on both sides until 1783. 1783, the Treaty of Paris finishes the war for the United States, the independence of which is recognized, and the British, but not for the tribes who weren't parties to the Treaty of Paris. The British are gone, the British are done, but what the United States had to do then, the Confederal or Confederation government, was go out and make peace with the various tribes that had been engaged in warfare against the United States. And so we have a number of immediate post-war treaties between the United States and tribes that are essentially finishing the Revolutionary War as far as those tribes in the United States are concerned. And they're very interesting for these treaties. I'm going to focus on two of them for what they attempted to do from the U.S. perspective, but what they attempted to do unsuccessfully. And the treaties I want to focus on are the treaties of Fort Stanwix of 1785 and Fort McIntosh, or 1784 rather, and Fort McIntosh of 1785, which ended the Revolution as far as a lot of those New York tribes, the Haudenosaunee tribes and others were concerned, and the United States. Because what the U.S. attempted to do in those treaties, and mind, this is just after the Americans have won their independence successfully, have beaten the British, who were believed by many to have the most powerful army in the world. And I think the Americans, the United States, was feeling fairly flush. And so in these immediate post-war treaties, post-war with Britain, the treaties ending the war with these tribes from the upper middle states, the United States claimed to have conquered them. And they're treaties that are flush with the language of military victory. We won, we went to war with you, we won, and consequently, we get a lot of your stuff. So land is claimed, the tribes agree on the face of the treaty to cede large amounts of land, and it's uncompensated. It's land, in the view of the United States, fairly won by force of arms in a just war, and so it belongs to us. Now, this is fascinating because it marks a moment at which we see a road that in the end is not taken. This is the time at which the Americans, in a sense, started behaving a bit like the Spanish had in Latin America, in South America, and Central America, and the islands in the 16th century. We won, so your stuff belongs to us. We own it by right of conquest. And in this case, as would have been the case in the early 17th century in the English colonies, this sort of claim was overreaching. It was unsustainable. It was militarily unsustainable, and the Confederation government recognized this almost immediately. The Secretary of War at the end of the Confederation government, and the guy who will become the first Secretary of War under the U.S. Constitution in the Washington administration, a man named Henry Knox, thought that this was a big mistake, that the U.S. can't sustain this, and that it's not the best platform on which to build future relations with the indigenous nations. This idea that we've conquered you so we get your stuff. And contemporaneously, we start to see a movement in a different direction in the Confederation. So these treaties, 1784, 1785, right after the 1783 Treaty of Paris, are followed in 1787 by an ordinance that the Confederation Congress passes relating to the northwestern lands that are now claimed by the United States. These are the lands that will be the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. In July 1787, the Confederation government issues its Northwest Ordinance, and included in that is a provision that sets forth how the government intends to acquire Indian lands in those areas. And it's not by right of conquest. It's not by military action. Instead, the Northwest Ordinance provides the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them. The Northwest Ordinance policy was what we might call a purchase policy. We will acquire Indian lands, that was expected, but we're going to do so by using the old English model. Treaties, we're going to continue making treaties, but they're going to be treaties in which something's provided from both sides. They're not going to be treaties claiming acquisition rights by conquest. And the government believed this so strongly that when Henry Knox becomes Secretary of War, he goes out and renegotiates the treaties of Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh. And in the renegotiated treaties, provides compensation for those lands formerly claimed by right of conquest. This is our only period, this immediate post-war period, post-war with England, post-Treaty of Paris period, in which the United States has made this claim to lands by right of conquest. Ever since then, during the remainder of the treaty-making period, the claim is made to title by purchase through some sort of treaty negotiation. Now, as we'll see, the treaties aren't always fair. There are lots of problems with the treaty-making process, but it's a line that the United States sticks to, and I think it's important as a matter of law because it's an indication of the seriousness with which this notion of indigenous sovereignty was recognized. These are tribes, these are indigenous nations who are capable of entering into treaty relations with the United States. They have rights which are deserving of respect. And that was the platform on which Knox wanted to build the relationship that the United States had with the indigenous nations of North America. George Washington was of the same view, and it's part of the reason that he and Knox, I think, got along so well. The idea of establishing treaty-based relationships with the tribe in which things were given and taken on both sides seems to have been important to George Washington. And we'll see as we get further into this what happened to that vision in the hands of Washington's successors. Now, the Confederation dies in 1788. 1787, in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, the Confederation is the subject of a supposed amendment because it isn't working quite as well. It doesn't provide for quite the centralized power that the Confederation government in peacetime believes that it needs. There's some agitation, taxpayer resistance that leads to military conflict within the American political community. But in 1787, in the summer in Philadelphia, the convention called to amend the Articles decides to scrap them entirely and to put together a new document, which we called the Constitution of the United States. And that, too, will include a provision designed to centralize the conduct of Indian policy. The language isn't quite so express. Madison wanted to include a provision that said that the federal Congress shall have the power to regulate affairs with the Indians. That would have been essentially the first part of Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation, minus the confusing business about the states retaining powers within their limits. What the convention, the Constitutional Convention, decided to do, however, was to take Indian affairs and stick it in the Commerce Clause, which is found in Article 1, Section 8, so that that clause would read that Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states and with the Indian tribes and with foreign states. So that and with the Indian tribes language and its trade function is certainly a part of that, and maybe more. Evidently more was intended to be comprehended within that, but is included in the commerce power. Elsewhere in the Constitution, though, there are powers that the Congress and the court decided effectively federalized the making of Indian policy. The two most important, the treaty power, which says that only Congress makes treaties, and treaties, remember, have been assumed by the United States, as they had been during the British Empire, as the principal vehicle for effectuating relations with the tribes. And if all goes wrong, the war power, which is exclusively a federal power, and maybe the means of enforcing treaty obligations, if that happens to be the view of the government in power. So with this new Constitution in place, a new presidential administration, the Washington administration, taking office under the Constitution in 1789, with a new Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and a new Congress that's vested with the power to regulate commerce with the Indians and effectively maybe to do everything else connected with Indian affairs, we enter into a new era, which will be the topic of our next lecture.